And so about a decade ago, we started looking at the effects of one specific type of video game, which we call action video games. And so for those of you who don't know what action video games are, it's kind of a broad classification. It encompasses lots of subtypes of video games that you might be familiar with. Things like first-person shooter games, where you actually look through your player's eyes, and typically, 'cause it's just called shooter, you're shooting at bad guys. It also includes third-person shooter games, where you're looking at the back of your character, some car driving game. Basically, they all share a set of qualitative features, things like very fast motion, many transient events, so things pop in and out of the screen very quickly. What we would call high perceptual load, which basically just means that there are lots of things on the screen that you have to keep track of at once, simultaneously. And also the real need for peripheral processing. So often you're looking right in the center of the screen, but you kind of have to be monitoring the whole screen because, for instance, enemies often first come in at the edge of the screen. And so these games have these kind of set of qualitative features that what we've seen over the past decade really strongly enhances the visual system in a very general way. And so before I talk about the effects we've seen, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how we do the studies, because actually the methodology is something that's of interest to lots of people. The first thing that we always do is kind of do the natural experiment. There are people who, as part of their day-to-day life, play lots and lots of this type of video game. And so we select people who play at least 5 hours a week of any type of action video games for at least the past year, and typically they've been playing these games for much longer than the past year. And we compare their visual performance with people who don't play action games. They might play other types of games. They might play strategy games or simulation games, but they do not play action games. And so we compare these two groups and ask, well, is it the case that the people who naturally play lots of these action video games have better visual capabilities than people who don't naturally play these games? However, after we do this kind of cross-sectional natural study, we always then have to actually do a training study. We have to actually take people who don't play action games and give them experience with action games and say, well, is it the case that action gaming experience actually improves your vision? And we have to do this because, well, when you just do the natural experiment, you compare people who play lots of a certain type of game with people who don't, you have to worry about selection bias. It could be the case that, well, people who are born with good vision tend to play these active kinds of games because they're rewarded for it. And people who are born with poor vision tend not to play these games because they're punished, because they don't have good visual capabilities to begin with. What we want to show is that it's actually the act of playing the games that leads to the enhanced vision. And so the way we do this is we take a group of people who don't play action video games, males and females. We test them on whatever measures we're interested in. And then we actually bring them to the lab for 10 or 20. Most recently, we bring them in for 50 hours, spaced over the course of usually 2 or 3 months. They come to the lab. They play these games for an hour and a half at a time, maybe 8 hours a week. And then at the end of training, so at the end of these 50 hours that they've been playing these games, we post-test them on the tests of interest, so the visual tests. And we compare them to a group that also doesn't play video games, also did the pre-tests of interest, and also were trained on a video game. However, they're trained on a non-action video game. So we have people come in, they play action video games, and we have people come in that play, say, The Sims, a simulation game. And so what we're really interested in is it the case that the people who played the action video games improved by more than the people who played the control video games, The Sims, for instance. And so The Sims offers us a control for things like test-retest effects. It's often the case that people will improve just from taking a test a second time. But also controls for more subtle psychological effects, for instance, the Hawthorne effect, wherein people who have an interest taken in their performance tend to perform better than people who don't. So we wouldn't want to compare a group that we had spent the last 3 months with training on action video games with a group that we'd only met twice. So what we have are these two groups that are identical in all ways except for the exact experience they've been getting. One has been trained on action games and one's been trained on a control game. And then we can ask, is it the case that actually playing action video games improves the visual system in a broad way? And so what we've seen over the past decade is that indeed playing these action games improves a wide range of perceptual and cognitive abilities. And this is true from kind of the lowest levels of vision all the way up to what people think of as higher level cognitive abilities. And so I'll just give a couple of examples at these various levels. So at the level of very, very low level vision, talk about something known as contrast sensitivity. Now, contrast sensitivity is just your ability to tell the difference between levels of gray. It's basically, can you tell that this is a white pixel and this is a slightly gray pixel? It's to some extent the fundamental aspect of vision. If you can't tell that two adjacent parts of the visual field have different amounts of luminance, you really can't see anything at all. And so what we've seen is that, training on these action video games actually improves this very basic skill, this very low-level visual ability, contrast sensitivity. After training on action video games, people can actually distinguish lower levels of contrast than they could before the training. And so this is of use not only in obvious kind of military applications, but also there's a range of visual deficits. So many of you have probably heard of lazy eye, also known as amblyopia. This is a condition wherein an individual has poor vision in one eye. Often it's due to either childhood strabismus, where one eye the two eyes aren't properly aligned, so one is typically off to one side, or childhood cataracts, where in early development the lens is clouded, so they don't have proper visual experience. And so individuals who have this in childhood often grow up to have amblyopia. They have poor vision. And so one of the major problems they have is they have very poor contrast sensitivity in their bad eye. And so actually training on these action video games, colleagues at UC Berkeley have actually done this experiment. Training on these action video games in these individuals with these poor visual capabilities actually improves. It doesn't just improve their contrast sensitivity, it also improves other low-level visual abilities, for instance, acuity. Acuity is what you'd get measured with an eye chart. So when you go to the DMV and get measured on an eye chart, they're measuring your acuity. It's basically your ability to resolve fine details. And so in the study published by the group at Berkeley, it actually improved their vision by about 2 lines on an eye chart, which is a pretty significant amount for these individuals. So moving up to slightly higher level vision is actually one of the tasks that we asked you to take part in prior to this lecture. It's known as the useful field of view task, and it's basically a visual search task. Those of you who actually did the task will be quite familiar with it. You're basically looking for a target that's very quickly flashed in kind of a big field of clutter. And so the reason this task is actually of interest is that it was originally designed by researchers at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And their goal was to find a task that's predictive of driving accidents in the elderly. It turns out that the tests that you do at the DMV, so for instance here in Wisconsin we do an eye chart and we do a little task where you have to say whether or not light turned on in your peripheral vision. Those tasks, it turned out, aren't particularly predictive of driving accidents, especially in the elderly. To some extent it makes sense. People don't tend to run into things that they're looking right at. Where accidents tend to occur, say at intersections, where people fail to pick out important targets, say a car approaching, from amongst distractors, say a bunch of parked cars or street signs. And so this visual search task, known as the useful field of view, actually does a pretty good job of testing this ability. Can you actually pick out task-relevant information, these targets, from amongst stuff that's just there to distract you? And so, again, we've seen that playing these action video games really strongly promotes this ability, this what we call visual selective attention. You can pick out the parts of the scene that are important and kind of tamp down the parts of the scene that are unimportant.